Wyoming Territory, late October, 1883. The wind had teeth that morning, biting sharp through the cottonwoods lining the edge of the Lawson ranch. Luke Lawson stepped out of the barn, breath curling in the cold air, a saddle slung over his shoulder and a half-formed curse on his lips. He had not slept much. Cattle had broken fence again out by the south ridge, but the weight that stopped him in his tracks was not from fatigue. It was the sound, soft like a whimper, then a cough, not a calf, a baby's cry. Luke dropped the saddle onto the hay-strewn floor and moved fast toward the back shed. It was a small building, barely more than a lean-to, used for tools and feed. The door was half open, creaking with the wind. Inside, in a nest of burlap sacks and old horse blankets, a young woman lay curled on her side, holding a bundled infant to her chest. She looked up at him, eyes wide and hollow from fear or exhaustion or both. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Just her eyes. "Please." Luke took one step in and crouched, his voice low and steady. "You and the baby, all right?" She nodded slowly. Her hands clutched the child tighter. A girl, maybe 6 months old. The woman was covered in dust, her dress torn at the hem and fraying at the sleeves. Her boots were worn near through. She looked like she had walked to the end of the world. Luke's voice came softer now. "You hungry?" She nodded again. He reached out a hand toward her. "Come on. You do not have to be scared. You're safe here. I swear it." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she shifted upright, cradling her baby against her shoulder as she reached for his hand. As Luke helped her up, she swayed. He caught her gently with one arm and steadied her. She was light as a feather. She looked up at him again, eyes glassy with something that made his chest twist up tight. "Please," she whispered. He did not look away. "Always." Her name was Laurel Vance. 23. She had walked 3 days from a mining camp outside Thermopolis, carrying her daughter, Josie. Her husband had died in a shaft collapse 2 months back. After that, the men in the camp had turned mean. One got drunk and tried to force his way into her tent. She had run that night with nothing but a satchel of biscuits, a blanket, and Josie in her arms. Luke listened to it all while she sat by his kitchen stove, the baby in her lap, wrapped in a clean quilt. He gave her hot coffee and eggs, then dug out an old wool coat from the back room and laid it over her shoulders. "You can stay here tonight," he said. "As long as you need, really." "I do not want charity," she said, voice shaking. "I can work." "You do not owe me anything," Luke answered. Then he added, "But if it helps you feel better, I could use help with the hens. They keep laying in the damn strangest places." That made her smile, just a little. But it lit something behind her eyes that had been missing when he first found her. The next morning came gray and quiet. Snow threatened in the clouds. Luke found her already awake, rocking Josie near the hearth. "I used to be a seamstress," she said, not looking up. "I can mend, too." Luke poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "Then I have a stack of shirts that could use your hands." She looked over at him. "You are kind." "I am just a man with a big empty house," he said, setting her cup down beside her. "And you and Josie filled it up overnight." Laurel blinked at him, then looked down at her daughter, who was gumming the edge of the quilt. "I did not think anyone would help me," she murmured. "Not after everything. Not with her." Luke leaned on the table, watching her. "You both belong here now, if you want to." The days passed quiet but full. Laurel took to the ranch work with quiet discipline. She cleaned, mended, cooked simple meals. Josie watched the world with wide blue eyes, tucked into a sling across her mother's chest as she worked. Luke found himself shifting his days to be near them. He showed her how to gather eggs without getting pecked. She taught him how to re-stitch a torn collar straight. They spoke in soft tones, shared long silences, And every time Laurel looked at him with those eyes that had once begged for safety, and now only asked for something steadier, Luke felt his heart fold around her tighter. One evening, snow began to fall. Light flakes danced against the windows as the three of them sat in the parlor, Laurel knitting, Luke whittling, Josie asleep in a cradle Luke had found in the attic and dusted off for her. "You lost someone?" Laurel asked softly, her fingers still. Luke nodded. "My brother. Smallpox took him when we were 18. Parents went a year later. Fever and heartbreak." She looked at him with quiet understanding. "I know what that kind of empty feels like." He set down his knife. "Maybe it is not empty anymore." She looked away, chest rising with a breath that trembled. "Do you mean that?" Luke stood and crossed to her, kneeling at her feet. He took her hand gently. "I meant it when I found you, when you looked at me like I was the last safe place in the world. I meant it when I said, always." Laurel's eyes filled, but she did not cry. She leaned forward and rested her forehead to his. "I have nothing to offer but myself," she whispered. "And that is what I want," he said. "You, Josie. All of it." She kissed him, then shy at first, then with a deep, quiet ache that had waited too long to be touched. Luke wrapped his arms around her, steady and sure. Outside, the snow began to fall heavier. Inside, a family small and unexpected began to build itself out of warmth and trust, one heartbeat at a time. By mid-November, the wind no longer whistled, it groaned low across the valley, dragging snow in long white streaks. Laurel had taken to keeping a fire going in the parlor throughout the day, feeding it with cottonwood and pine. Luke had hauled in by wagon before the frost deepened. Josie had begun crawling, slow and clumsy, trailing lint on her dress and reaching for the hems of everything she could find. Laurel never let her out of arm's reach. One afternoon, Luke came in from checking the fence line with a new scrape down his knuckles and mud caked along the cuffs of his trousers. He shook off the cold and watched Laurel from the doorway as she knelt beside Josie, placing a wooden spoon just out of reach to coax her forward. "You ever think she'd get this far?" Luke asked, stepping out of his boots. Laurel didn't look up. "I prayed she would. But back then, I didn't see past the next hour." He moved closer. "She's stubborn. Got that from someone. She's got more than that." Laurel picked Josie up and settled her on her hip. "She listens when you sing out there. Stops fussing every time your voice comes through the window." Luke scratched the back of his neck, uneasy. "Didn't think I had much of a tune." "You carry one just fine," she said, brushing hair from her face. "And she knows who keeps her safe." Luke looked at her, then at Josie, who had gone still, small thumb tucked into her mouth. "You ever want to teach her where you came from? Your people, I mean." Laurel stiffened slightly. "I was born in Kansas. My father was a wheelwright. My mother died young. I don't remember her face anymore, just her hands." "What about after?" Luke asked gently. Laurel turned toward the fire. "After I married, I stopped thinking of where I came from. Just tried to stay upright. There wasn't room to look back." Luke sat on the arm of the chair, close enough for the fire's warmth to reach both of them. "You don't have to talk about it." She met his eyes. "I do. Just not all at once." A log cracked in the hearth. Josie stirred and laid her head against her mother's collarbone. Luke spoke again, slower this time. "I've been thinking about the bunkhouse. It's just sitting out there empty. Needs airing out, but come spring I could fix it up for someone else. Hire on another hand." Laurel didn't answer right away. Then she said, "You expecting company?" "No," he said. "But maybe I want room for something better than empty buildings." Laurel looked down at her daughter, then over at him. "I don't think I know what better means yet. It might just mean time," Luke said, standing, "and not having to run from anything." The next morning, Laurel found a package wrapped in oilskin on the kitchen table. Inside was a spool of indigo thread, 2 lengths of muslin, and a worn silver thimble that had likely belonged to a woman long gone. Luke was already outside splitting wood. By the following week, she had made Josie 2 new dresses and patched the sleeve of Luke's coat without being asked. She didn't bring up the thimble, and he didn't press her about it. Instead, they moved through their days with slow rhythm, like folks who'd been living side by side for years instead of weeks. On a clear afternoon, after the last snow had melted off the barn roof, Luke led a chestnut mare into the yard and called Laurel down from the porch. "She's gentle," he said. "Wouldn't spook even if thunder cracked right beside her." Laurel stepped down carefully. "Why show me this?" "Because you said you hadn't been on a horse since Josie was born. Figured it was time you remembered how the sky looks when you're not walking." Laurel hesitated before taking the reins. "You really think I should?" "I think you need to," Luke said. "You've earned more than solid ground." She mounted slowly, unsure at first, but once she settled in the saddle, her back straightened. Luke lifted Josie into his arms and stood beside the mare as Laurel moved in a slow circle around them. When she stopped again, cheeks flushed from the wind, she looked down at him. "I forgot how it feels to see a little farther than the next step." Luke smiled, soft at the edges. "That's all I ever wanted for you." She reached down, brushing her fingers against his. "And what do you want for yourself?" He didn't answer right away. Josie babbled something unintelligible and tugged at his collar. Luke looked up at Laurel. "To keep watching you remember." And just like that, something shifted between them, quiet as snowfall, sure as spring coming through the frost. The first warm day in weeks landed quiet and steady, like the sky had finally decided to ease up. Laurel hung damp linens across the split rail fence, sleeves lifting gently in the breeze. The scent of wood smoke and sun-warmed grass filled the yard. Josie napped in a cradle basket tucked beneath the porch overhang, cheeks flushed with sleep. Luke crossed the yard with a pair of fence pliers in one hand, a coil of wire over his shoulder. He paused at the sight of Laurel, her hair caught in the wind, her hands working cloth against wood. "Never seen someone lay out a line so straight," he said. Laurel glanced over her shoulder but didn't stop. "Comes from years of trying to make something clean out of what's been tangled too long." Luke stepped closer, set the tools down near his boots. "You think that's what we're doing here?" "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe we're just giving things room to breathe." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, just long enough to settle between them without needing to be filled. Luke shifted his stance. "I've been meaning to ask. That locket you wear, who's inside?" Laurel touched the chain at her throat, the silver dulled with age. "It's empty," she said. "It was my mother's. Never got a picture to put in." He nodded slowly. "Would you want one?" She looked at him then, and the corners of her mouth lifted, not in amusement, not in surprise, just simple and real. "If I did, I think I know what I'd choose." Later that evening, with the sky gone deep rose and the last of the cows settled near the far fence, Laurel sat at the table stitching a hem. Luke carved a new yoke for the ox sled near the fire. The room held the kind of stillness that only came when no one felt the need to speak. Josie stirred in her cradle and whimpered once. Laurel rose to check her, but Luke was already there, lifting her gently and cradling her against his shoulder. Josie quieted almost instantly, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "She takes to you," Laurel said, watching. Luke swayed slightly, rocking without thinking. "She's got a way of reminding me what matters." Laurel moved closer, her voice lower now. "You think you could love her like your own?" Luke didn't look away from the child. "I already do." The fire popped behind them. Laurel reached out and touched his arm, hand resting just above the bend of his elbow. "And me. He turned to her then, still holding Josie, and for the first time his voice caught. I wanted to speak it before, but words been too easy. I'd rather show you. She stepped in, resting her head lightly against his shoulder opposite the child. Then don't stop showing me. They stood like that until Josie drifted into sleep again, and neither moved until the fire burned down low. The next morning, Luke took the wagon into town. Supplies were low, and the plow needed a new bolt. Laurel stayed behind, tending the coop and washing out the feed troughs. She wore one of Luke's old flannel shirts beneath her apron, sleeves rolled to the elbow. When he returned hours later, she met him near the gate, hands dusted with flour and a streak of ash across her cheek. You bring back more than nails? She asked. He lifted a wrapped bundle from the wagon bed. Had the photographer come up from Lander. Took his time, but he managed something decent. She opened it carefully, hands deliberate. Inside, a small tintype. Josie in her lap, Laurel seated straight-backed, eyes calm and steady. Luke stood beside them, one hand resting on the back of her chair, the other on the child's shoulder. No one's ever kept a picture of me before, she said. I will, he told her. She looked at the image again, then up at him. Might be time to fill the locket. He helped her tuck the tintype inside. She clicked it shut, the weight of it resting just above her heart. They didn't say anything else. But when the sun dipped behind the hills and the chickens settled in for the night, Laurel reached for his hand and didn't let go. And Luke, without needing to speak a word, understood. She wasn't waiting anymore. A soft drizzle fell over the valley, soaking the earth and bringing out the scent of damp sage and warm cedar. The air was quiet except for the patter of rain on the porch roof and the low huff of cattle moving slow across the ridge. Inside, Laurel stood barefoot on the kitchen plank floor, her palms dusted with cornmeal, sleeves pushed high as she kneaded dough in a wide clay bowl. Luke leaned against the doorframe, watching the way she moved with quiet focus. Her hair, damp from the walk back from the spring house, clung in loose strands to her neck. He didn't speak until she looked up, her brow still furrowed in concentration. You ever think about what you'd do if you weren't here? He asked. Laurel planted her hands firm in the dough. You mean if I'd ended up somewhere else? I mean if you'd had a choice. She pressed her thumb into a groove along the rim of the bowl. I used to think I'd open a dry goods shop, one with bolts of fabric along the back wall and glass jars of licorice on the counter. I liked the idea of people stopping in just to feel something soft. Luke crossed the room and pulled a chair out beside her. Still could. She shook her head. I wouldn't trade this for it. A roof that doesn't leak. A man who doesn't raise his voice. A daughter who wakes up smiling. That's more than I ever knew to ask for. He reached over and brushed a bit of flour from her wrist. I'd build you the shelves if you wanted them. I don't want shelves, she said, quiet now. I just want you to keep coming back through that door. Josie started to cry from the front room, her voice sharp and sudden. Laurel wiped her hands on her apron and turned, but Luke was already halfway there. He scooped the child up and walked her around slowly, murmuring low. Laurel watched them from the kitchen, her breath catching at the small, familiar way Josie's hand curled into Luke's collar. By the time supper was laid out, fried salt pork, boiled potatoes, and a cobbler made from what remained of the Jared blackberries, Josie had drifted off again in her mother's arms. They ate by lamplight, the storm rolling distant thunder over the hills, and the windows fogged from the warmth inside. Luke pushed his plate back, then sat forward, elbows on the table. I reckon I've got something to ask you. Laurel set her fork down, not quite meeting his eyes. What sort of something? I've got a deed to the land. It's in my name. Always has been. But I want to add yours. She blinked, slow. Why? Because this place is yours now. You've made it more than it was. And I want Josie to grow up knowing her name belongs here same as mine." Laurel stared at him, the light from the oil lamp catching the edge of her locket. "You'd sign over your own land?" "I'd sign over my whole name if it meant keeping you here." Her eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "I never had anything that couldn't be taken." "Well," he said, "you've got me, and I don't rattle easy." She reached across the table, her hand finding his. "Then write my name beside yours. Not below, not after. That's where it was always meant to go." That night, after Josie was put down and the fire burned low, Laurel stepped out onto the porch wrapped in one of Luke's wool blankets. The rain had stopped, and the stars were beginning to press through the clouds. She stood there for a while, quiet, breathing in the smell of wet earth and pine. Luke came out behind her, boots light across the boards. He didn't speak, just wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. "I wasn't looking for a life when I found you in that shed," he said softly. "But I think maybe I found mine." She leaned back into him, her voice no louder than the wind through the grass. "You didn't find it. You made it." And they stood there until the stars came out in full, the valley stretching wide and quiet before them, and the world finally felt like it belonged to them both. The first thaw came slow, bleeding quietly through the soil in muddy streaks that pulled at boot heels and softened the shape of the land. By the time the ice broke on the creek behind the barn, Laurel had planted early greens in the garden beds Luke had turned over for her, and Josie had begun standing on her own, gripping the edge of the porch rail for balance with her jaw set like she meant to conquer the whole world. Luke began rising earlier, riding the property line before the light settled into full morning. Laurel watched him from the window sometimes, his silhouette cutting against the low sun as he moved through the mist. He always came back with the same calm in his step, as if the land breathed easier now that it had someone to belong to again. One evening, as the wind quieted and the last of the supper plates were drying by the hearth, Laurel hung a length of muslin in the bedroom doorway. Luke looked up from where he sat oiling his saddle straps. "You making curtains?" he asked. She folded the fabric once more before answering. "A veil." He set the cloth aside. "You sure?" Laurel turned to face him, her fingers still. "I've lived in fear. I've lived in silence. I've lived in places where my name didn't carry past a whisper." But here he stood before she could finish, closing the space between them. "Here," she said, softer now, "I'm not a burden. I'm not someone's memory. I'm just a woman who wants to marry a man because she loves him." Luke reached for her hand. "Then let's not wait." They married beneath the cottonwood tree that leaned over the rear pasture, its branches just beginning to bud. The preacher from Lander brought his wife along, and she cradled Josie on her lap as Laurel stood in a dress sewn from blue calico Luke had found the month before. There were no guests beyond the pair who'd come to witness. No music, no fanfare. Just a man and a woman and the child who'd bound them together before either had dared to speak of love. After the vows, Laurel pressed her palm to Luke's chest and said nothing. He leaned forward and kissed her brow, then her lips, slow and sure, while the creek gurgled in the distance and Josie laughed from the preacher's wife's arms, delighted by the wind in the leaves. That night, after the guests had gone and the candles burned low, Laurel sat beside Luke on the edge of their bed, her hair unpinned and loose down her back. "I never thought I'd feel this still," she said. He traced his thumb along the inside of her wrist. "You're not still. You're rooted." She leaned into him, her voice a whisper against his skin. "Then I hope I stay planted here until my hair turns white." Spring stretched into early summer, bringing long days and soft evenings. Luke built a second coop behind the barn, and Laurel spent mornings with Josie in the garden, coaxing beans from the soft earth and humming tunes passed down from a mother she could barely remember. Josie grew stronger, taking wobbly steps between her mother's skirts and her father's boots, arms flung wide in triumph each time she made it. One warm evening, Laurel sat on the porch steps, Josie asleep against her chest. Luke handed her a small wooden box, its lid carved with a simple wild rose. Inside was a set of silver hair combs, the edges engraved with tiny stars. "My mother wore these when she married," he said. "I know you already had your day, but I wanted you to have them." Laurel ran her thumb along the curve of one comb, then looked up. "These are the kind of things people pass down." Luke nodded. "That's the hope." Years passed, but the shape of their days remained steady. They added another room to the house, then another. A second child came along, a boy with Laurel's quiet eyes and Luke's easy hands. The ranch grew in small ways: more hens, a second milk cow, a neighbor's son come to work fence in exchange for supper and a place to sleep. But the heart of it never changed. They rose each morning with soft words and shared warmth. They worked side by side, mending what broke, planting what could grow. At night, when the children were tucked into their beds and the lamps burned low, they sat close, hands always finding one another, as if even in the stillness, they never stopped choosing each other. Laurel never opened a dry goods shop. She didn't need to. Her shelves were lined with jars she'd filled by hand. Her table set each week with bread she'd kneaded while Josie chattered at her feet. And Luke never looked for more land. He had what he needed: wind that didn't bite, earth that held steady, and a home that began the day a woman and her child laid down in his shed and reminded him what it meant to be needed and loved. And so the seasons turned, and the valley held them. And they were happy. Always.